Hi, seventh grade. Welcome back. We're going to continue reading today with chapter 8 from our novel, Across 5 Aprils by Irene Hunt. This is one of the shorter chapters that we have. It is only 8.5 pages long. So it is my hope that we'll get through this in a shorter lesson, but I might have a lot to talk about. So we'll see. Let's take a look at the questions that we have for this chapter that we will need to answer. All right, so chapter 8, we have 6 questions. Question 1, why did Jethro hate to think of Shiloh? 2, why was the Union Army demoralized in 1862? Demoralized would be to lose their morals, or that they're not feeling the same towards the war that they were before. And that I believe that might be one of our vocab words in Spelling City. So hopefully it's a little clearer to you there. Question 3, what did the men think of General McClellan? So we've had several Union generals that we've looked at being towards the top. General Grant was one of them. And if you remember, he was demoted after the Battle of Shiloh because he really didn't have it together. And General McClellan, I believe, was one of the top generals at the time as well. Question 4, what happened to McClellan? And 5, who was Ambrose Burnside? And 6, although Stone's River had been a victory, what did John write to Nancy about it? And actually, before we go to the book, I do want to comment on Shiloh and Pittsburgh Landing, because those two go together synonymously. So on the map behind me is this big blue spot, which was the one that is labeled Pittsburgh Landing, and we've talked about that. Pittsburgh Landing is the location of the Battle of Shiloh. I can't remember which one. I think Shiloh is the river, and they kind of have both of those names that go along there. That's the battle that I was just mentioning that Grant kind of lost his reputation at. So as we begin reading about 1862, when he mentioned Shiloh, he's also referencing Pittsburgh Landing. Those are the same thing. And I'm wondering if you remember what happened to the family in reference to that battle. And if you don't, I believe we're going to come across it in our book in just a minute. So let's go to our book then. We are on chapter 8, which is on page 119. Please read along with me. The autumn of '62 was grim. Looking back to the spring and early summer, Jethro realized that although the early months had meant anxiety and fear for himself and his family, the cause of the Union had been going well in the West. He counted the federal victories, beginning with Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, always to be associated in his memory with that last firelit evening he had spent with Shadrach. On to Pea Ridge, from which Mr. Roscoe's grandson had emerged unharmed, to the Mississippi, where grim old Admiral Farragut had done the impossible and had taken over New Orleans, and where General Pope, blusterer though he may be, was hailed as a hero after he had taken New Madrid and the powerful Confederate fort at Island No. 10. Jethro studied the map of the Mississippi carefully. Only a strip of the river between Baton Rouge and Vicksburg was then under Confederate control. "We're doing better than Shad allowed we would," he told Jenny. He measured the short strip on the map with his fingers. "Look, it's just this little piece of river. Once we take that, it's like Shadrach told me, the Confederacy will be cut in two." So I'm going to pause for a second so hopefully we can see on our map. I did draw the blue line here. That is all the Mississippi. And what did he say? Baton Rouge to Vicksburg. So Vicksburg is here. And Baton Rouge is here. So you see this space here? That is the only part that is still under Confederate control. New Orleans down here, he just mentioned, is taken. All of this is being controlled by the Union. All of this below here is also being controlled by the Union. And then this will split. We see Arkansas is with the Confederacy. Mississippi and Tennessee on the other side that will split them in two, which will start to break them apart. So that is good news. 1862, though, we are only a year and a half into the Civil War, and we know by our title we have 5 years. All right, let's go back to the book. And I'll turn the page. It was a very short strip as measured by his fingers, but a shadow swept across his eyes as he recalled Shadrach's words. Think how hard the fightin' was at this little dot on the map called Donelson. He thought of another dot, which was only peach orchards and an old church, where Tom and thousands of others had died, a dot that seemed a hateful place to him. He would have to grow older and learn from history that the battle had been one of great importance for the Union, that the Confederate attempt to regain Western Tennessee had failed and was therefore a bitter blow to the government of Jefferson Davis. But in 1862, Jethro hated to think of Shiloh, not only because of Tom, but because it seemed to him to have been an empty victory. So there's 2 parts to that answer. So when he's talking about Shiloh, we just mentioned that a little bit, that this is Shiloh, Pittsburgh Landing. Number 1, Tom died there. Number 2, he said it felt like an empty victory because they really didn't gain much ground, okay? It felt like the Confederates had just kind of given up for them. And if we remember the next battle right after that, they only made it to that little red line. They're slowly moving. It was slow progress. So it didn't feel like a whole lot happening. Okay. The triumphs along the Mississippi had made good news, and hopes throughout the North were at a high peak when chilling words came from Tennessee. There, 2 Confederate generals, Bragg and Smith, had driven the Federals out of the Cumberland Gap and were moving north to Kentucky, where they would surely reclaim that state if Don Carlos Buell couldn't stop them. Remember, Don Carlos Buell was he's one of the generals that, not Nancy, Jenny was like, ooh, I would name my kid Don Carlos Buell. He was a good-looking general. So it's up to him to stop these Confederate armies from moving in. Young Tom had helped to clinch Kentucky to the side of the Union at Donelson. Now Jethro read with a heavy heart that General Bragg was boasting of his intention to set up a Confederate governor of Kentucky. Equally chilling was the news from the East. General Pope, hero of Island Number 10, was no longer a hero in Virginia. At the end of August, just 13 months after the day when congressmen and their ladies had driven out to Bull Run for a day of picnicking and battle viewing, a second disaster for the Federals took place on the same spot. The Confederate generals were Lee and Stonewall Jackson, together with James Longstreet, who brought up reinforcements that saved the day for the Confederates, a good part of McClellan's army, as well as Pope's. The papers admitted was disorganized and hopeless. Okay, so we're starting to hear that name McClellan. We also have the General Pope, which are both for the Union, and it sounds like they don't really quite have it together, that they're disorganized and they don't really know what they're doing. All right, let's continue at the bottom of the page there. Thus, the high hopes that had given comfort to the North during the spring were almost crushed by early fall. Faith in the leaders was at its lowest ebb. Criticism of the president poured in from all sides. Armies were demoralized, and desertion began. So desertion, what does it mean to desert somebody or desert something? We're not talking about food that you eat. To desert means that you're leaving. They are leaving the army. Can they do that? Is that okay? No, you can't. Once you sign up for the army, you are in. You have to be discharged. If you just leave, that's AWOL, right? And they're going to be looking for you. That's not okay. First in a slow trickling, then in a flood as the months dragged on. Jethro read the news in dismay, and for the rest of the war, there was always a fear within him that disappointment and disaster inevitably followed hope. So let's go back and think about, why is this army demoralized? Why have they lost their morals? So we're going back to that paragraph before, where their leaders seem to be disorganized and hopeless. They're losing hope. Also, there's these other comments that so they don't have faith in their leaders. People are criticizing the president. There's no hope in the presidents. And then as they start to leave, what is the value in this anymore? So there's a little bit more to demoralization, but that's part of it within our answer. So do the best you can to answer that one. As of right now, if there's more, I'll point it out. Continuing on 121. But work on the farm had to go on, although armies faltered and leaders fell in disgrace. Faltered, like to blunder, make mistakes. Late in September, men from the nearby communities and from even as far away as Newton came to build a new barn, so that Matt Crichton's stock might have shelter before the winter snows set in. There were 20 or more of them, with teams and loads of logs, with saws and axes, and a barrel of cider to give their work a spark of holiday spirit. Ross Milton came, and although he was too crippled to work, the men were pleased to have him with them, and Jethro was delighted. When he went out to greet the editor, Jethro noticed the young man who had cared for his team that day in Newton, now sitting on a high load of logs behind Ross Milton's buggy. Milton jerked his thumb toward the wagon as he climbed slowly down from his seat. "Charlie is bringing that load of logs from a friend of yours," he told Jethro quietly. "I can't think of anybody down your way that is a special friend of mine," Jethro said, puzzled. "Dave Burdow," the editor answered. "I'd asked him to come with us today. He wouldn't, but he came to town yesterday and asked me to have someone bring up this load of logs he'd cut. He said, 'Tell the young one Dave Burdow is sending them to him.'" Jethro nodded. "I allow to get thanks." He paused and flushed as he looked up at the editor. "I want to send thanks to him, one way or the other." What did he just do there? He corrected his grammar. He's saying it the correct way, especially to the editor who's given him that book. "I've done it for you," Milton answered, smiling briefly at the evidence that his book had been read. "Dave isn't used to thanks. They make him restless. But he's listened, and more than that, he's shaken several hands that have been extended to him since the two of you rode together through that stretch of woods road last March. So word got around that Dave Burdow had helped Jethro in that particular situation, and people are saying thank you to Dave, even though he's a bit of a recluse. "I'm proud to hear it," Jethro said soberly. "Sorry, let's turn the page." "I thought you might be." Milton's turned toward the porch, where Matt waited to speak to him, and Jethro went back to show Charlie where to place his wagon and Burdow's gift. By noon, Ellen, with the help of Nancy and Jenny, had spread a long table out under the silver poplars in the dooryard, and here the men ate roasted meats and potatoes, vegetables, preserved from the summer garden, baked beans, and cornbread spread thickly with freshly churned butter. They had autumn peaches picked from the trees and sliced in golden cream, mounds of wild honey, and apples that Nancy's little boys had polished until they gleamed rosily against the white cloth. The season of plenty in southern Illinois had not been touched by the war, so that's good. There might have been no war at all for an hour or so, as the men ate and joked in the mellow sunlight of the dooryard. But during the afternoon, as he carried water and ran a dozen different errands, Jethro had heard them talk of a battle in the east. It was a place he had not quite known how to pronounce when he read it in the papers. Antietam. "Well, McClellan moved," Israel Thomas was saying. "You have to say that for him. He finally moved. Old Abe give him another chance at maybe now he'll get down to fighting, if that ain't asking too much of such a fine-haired general." So now the men are starting to talk about McClellan. We're going to find out their opinions. Ed Turner's face was full of disgust as he strained to lift a log into place. "Him get down to fighting? Don't ever think of it. He wants to strut around and brag and look handsome, but he don't want to fight, not him. I reckon old Abe was right. The Army of the Potomac is Mr. McClellan's bodyguard. Well, he drove Bobby Lee out of Maryland the other day, another man remarked. That much is to his credit. And if Bobby Lee had drove McClellan out, he'd have followed up and pestered the army that was in retreat. But not McClellan. No, he wastes thousands of boys. Then he sets back and rests, waiting for him that's left living to cheer him big. Ed Turner wiped the sweat from his eyes with an angry gesture. I got no use for McClellan. I don't know what old Abe means, tuckering to him like he was some little sawed-off king. What are they saying here? Let's give it a little bit more. We'll break it down after they're done talking. Then Tom Marin from Rose Hill spoke up. If you ask my opinion of McClellan, I'll tell you, I don't think he wants to win. I don't think he's ever really going to move in on the Rebs because their way of thinking is his way of thinking. Oh, I reckon he ain't that low. Old Abe must be not be quite that poor a pick in his head men, Israel Thomas objected. Maybe old Abe ain't losing his breath to lick the Rebs either. Did you ever think of that? Why is it he ain't freed the slaves? Is he afraid of hurting the feelings of some of his women's kinfolk down in Kentucky? Why does he put up with this no account that's running the Army of Potomac? Does he like seeing Bobby Lee run us over? I got a lot of questions about old Abe that I'd like an answer to. Your doubts ain't going to make me down on old Abe, Tom, Israel Thomas answered angrily. Things is tough right now, but this war is a big thing. It's mid and lazy for us farmers and big editors and the abolitionist preachers to run the job of being president. Old Abe is doing all he can do, I say, and I'm for him all the way. Okay, so let's back up to McClellan. What is it that's happened? What are the men saying about him? He doesn't move. So he has the Army of the Potomac. He's over in Tennessee. Was he in Tennessee? Where did they just say he was? No, Army of the Potomac is over in Virginia. Anyways, we were talking about Kentucky. So within here, which is a border state. But he's not moving. He's letting the Confederates come to him when they fight. So he did win one of these battles, but when he drove the Rebs or the Confederates away, he didn't follow them. He just let them leave and they kind of stayed put. Whereas they're saying if Bobby Lee had won that battle and was pushing them back, he would have followed them and would have continued to fight until he had as much as he could. So he's basically just standing his ground and maintaining where he is. What they're saying about these wasting the boys, he might be looking at this a different way. We'll see this later, but basically he has a lot of boys in his army, but he's not necessarily using them to fight. So they could be fighting and possibly losing their lives and continuing on. But as they stay put, they are still alive, and they're claiming that McClellan is keeping them alive so that they can cheer him on. He did have a bit of a reputation of being extremely handsome. They have pictures of him up on top of his horse and kind of looking like he is rather vain. So that's what some of that opinion is there. As far as our answer, what are the men saying? They're not terribly pleased with him because he's not moving, he's not continuing to fight. He's basically just holding his ground. So that's what they're saying there. He is one of the top generals, and this is causing them to then question Lincoln as well. Why is Lincoln leaving McClellan in charge when he's not pushing through and continuing to win? All right, so let's go back to our book. We're right here. One of the men took a drink from the water jug Jethro had brought up to the workers, and handing it back, he rumpled the boy's hair with rough affection. Be glad you're a boy, young feller, and don't have to pester yourself with all these troubles that men be suffering through these days, he said genially, which is kind of ironic because remember we just talked about him feeling like he's become the man of the house or the farm because he's taking care of everything. So apparently he doesn't have to worry about any of these bad things about war, though. Jethro had picked up a mannerism from his mother. He closed his eyes briefly, as if to hide from the world the exasperation with which the man's words struck him. He knew we must keep quiet. These men were kind, generous men, and anyway, a boy had no right to contradict a man's opinion. If they wished to think of him as an arrogant or an ignorant, not arrogant, ignorant meaning not knowing anything, child, he must not try to change their idea of him. But it was a bitter dose to swallow. A few days after the barn raising, a letter came from Shadrach in which he too discussed General McClellan from the viewpoint of a young soldier who had just known his first experience under fire. Antietam had been the baptismal battle for the young school teacher, and the letter to Jenny reflected the agony of a man new to the scenes of death and suffering. I did it again. Turn the page for you. We're right here. This time, Jenny read the letter in its entirety to the family, and then she quietly passed it to her father and to Jethro for rereading. The words of love that interspersed those of mental anguish were not ones that a silly girl blushed over and hoarded to herself. There was a new dignity about Jenny after that letter from Antietam. Of General McClellan, Shadrach wrote, I have never known men of my age, and many much older, who have so completely worshiped another man. So the soldiers, this is not your answer to what the men think, but the soldiers worship McClellan. They love him. They may be hungry, wounded, heartsick at the death of comrades, but they forget everything when they see him, and they break into cheers as if this hero had brought them nothing but pure joy. They accept suffering of any kind as something through which they can show their devotion to this leader. You have probably read of the disorganization and discouragement of this army after General Pope's defeat at Bull Run. It took only the sight of this small, handsome man, McClellan, dashing up and down the lines on horseback to restore confidence and courage. He shouted, waved his cap, encouraged their cheers, and fired his men with the kind of spirit that they showed here at Antietam. The men resent those of us who have not known him long, the ones who are silent when they cheer. I believe that a word against him might be as dangerous to the one who spoke it as a rebel bullet would be. They will not believe that he has ever been anything but right. They revile the president when rumors of his impatience with their general get around. I tell you frankly that the contagion of their devotion has not yet gripped me. Contagion is also one of our vocabulary words. It sounds quite a bit like contagious, and that's basically what it means. I do not dislike him. I believe that he is personally brave and devoted to the cause for which his men are fighting. But he is afraid of something, of sending the men who love him to their death, of making an error that will reflect upon the image of himself, which he knows to exist in the minds of his men. He does not have the cold approach to killing, the singleness of purpose, the brutal tenacity that the winner of this war, if there ever is to be one, must have. So tenacity is also one of our vocabulary words. It's kind of that stick-to-itiveness. And that's what the men previously were kind of talking about. Why didn't he follow them out and continue to fight in the battle? Instead, he's saving lives. So he doesn't really have that ruthlessness that a general might need to have in order to win well, he won a battle, but to continue to win and to also win the war. He cares too much about the lives of these men, and he cares too much about his image and for those people. So it's not that Shadrach doesn't like him, but he realizes that he's probably not going to be the man that's going to help us win this war. Continuing right here. The autumn months approached the end of the year in gloom. Fields of green corn turned yellow, and the leaves withered during the frosty nights, rattled as if in protest as Jethro drove his wagon down the rows and piled it high with full golden ears. Antietam was over, a name for history books, a battle at which men in later years, blessed with the advantage of hindsight, would wonder. Jethro, in his manhood, would learn of the incompetence the inability, the blindness, and the ghastly waste of life that followed a lost opportunity. In the autumn of 1862, he only knew that Antietam seemed much like Shiloh, a federal victory in which one was hard put to find a step forward or a step toward final triumph and peace. So once again, they held their ground, but they haven't moved anywhere. The career of General McClellan was almost over too. It would rise with another spurt later on. But that fall, the papers blazed with the news that the president had relieved the general of his command, and the name that had outshone all the others now plummeted into near obscurity. Now another man dominated the headlines briefly, very briefly. The new name was that of Ambrose Burnside. So what happened to McClellan? Just like Grant, he has now been demoted. He's lost his position as that top general, and the man replacing him is Ambrose Burnside. I think we get a little more information about Burnside in a minute. Let's keep reading. In December, Jethro looked for another river and another town in Shadrach's atlas. The river was the Rappahannock in Virginia. The little town lying on the river was Fredericksburg. The stories of the battle were ones that brought despair to the North. Fredericksburg had been undertaken with little probability of success. The papers claimed nothing could have been expected under the shabby plans, if indeed they were plans, other than appalling slaughter. But Burnside was a stubborn man, determined perhaps to show action and confidence where McClellan had shown hesitancy and uncertainty. Wave after wave of men were sent up the slopes of a chain of hills from the tops of which the entrenched Confederates mowed the Federals down until the ground was piled high with blue-clad bodies. Rumor was that this general, far back from the line of battle, had insisted that still more divisions be sent up the deadly hills, but that he was finally dissuaded by officers of lower rank and keener perception. So I want to pause for just a second. So Ambrose Burnside is kind of considered to be brutal, especially in comparison to General McClellan. So you've probably heard it said before that when you're fighting, the person with higher ground is at the advantage. Absolutely, that's what's happening here. There is this steep ridge that they're going up, and the Confederates are at the top of the ridge. They're entrenched in it, so they've dug down, and they're possibly, on their belly shooting down the hill at them. So if you're shooting up the hill and they're down in it, you're not necessarily going to get them. Burnside is forcing his men to run up the hill, and they're being shot upon as they come up. This is a terrible tragedy. Not only does he send one wave of men up that hill to be killed, but he sends multiples run after. He's using those, to me, that's a waste of life versus the comparison to McClellan. So that was a horrible battle there. He's trying to maybe make up for those things that McClellan didn't do, but he did finally stop sending them up. We're right about here. Shadrach must have been at Fredericksburg. There could be little doubt of it. The family waited for days, during which Jethro's waking thoughts were filled with foreboding and his dreams with troubled anxiety. Foreboding is a fear of the future. Jenny went about her work silently, and although there was work enough to tire the healthiest of young bodies, she took to going for long walks alone through the wintry fields, as Bill had once done. There was nothing one could say to comfort her. Finally, a letter came, word from Shadrach that he was safe. He wrote, "It is unfortunate that congressmen and their ladies should have been deprived of this spectacle. There was drama here. I can tell them, thousands upon thousands of us crossing the Rappahannock with banners flying, drums rolling, and our instruments of death gleaming in the sunlight. They could have seen those thousands scrambling up the innocent-looking wooded hills and falling like toy soldiers, brushed over by a child's hand. Thousands of young men whose dreams and hopes were snuffed out in a second. and who will be remembered only as simple soldiers who fell in a cruel, futile battle directed by men who can hardly be called less than murderers. So futile means it was hopeless. And the men that were calling this, they knew those boys were dying. They were way in the back and kept sending them. So Shadrach's calling them murderers. I should not like to live with Ambrose Burnside's thoughts, though one wonders if his conscience is not protected by a thick covering of stubborn self-righteousness. Need I say that the men in the Army of the Potomac do not cheer General Burnside? So remember, the Army of the Potomac, these are the men who were for McClellan, but McClellan has lost his position and now they're following Ambrose Burnside. And this would be a demoralization too, because you've gone from a man who cared about you to somebody who's going to ultimately send you to your death and not care. Okay, in Tennessee, there was the place called Stones River. John was there, and in the early days of 1863, he wrote to Nancy of what had happened in that battle. He wrote of a commander named Rosecrans, Old Rosie, the men called him, who had repulsed Van Dorn, the Van Dorn of Pea Ridge, Jethro thought. When the Confederates attempted to retake Corinth and had later replaced Don Carlos Buell, too much the McClellan type of general had been relieved of his command. Man, these generals keep losing their position. The Union just can't find a general that's going to do what they need them to. John wrote of bitter cold and suffering that had finally ended with a victory of sorts when the Confederate General Bragg had left in full retreat, stopped short in his move toward Kentucky. Stones River was a victory, but there were 13,000 casualties. And John wrote wearily, the suffering and scenes of death was such as to make a man's heart hate war. So even though they won, there were a lot of deaths. Fredericksburg and Stones River. The stories of these two battles filled the papers during the last days of 1862 and the early ones of 1863. Everyone was discouraged, and it looked as if the war might never be won, as if indeed, the country that had been born in the travail of the Revolution and had been given direction during the days of 1787, when the Constitution came to life, might now be dissolved into two weak nations. Well, why not? Soldiers were beginning to say. How much can men bear to keep together the nation that their great-grandfathers had helped to create? They were losing faith in their leaders and in the cause of the Union. In the late winter of 1862, the deserters began pouring back into Illinois. So deserters are those men who have left fighting, even though they're not supposed to. Thousands of young men had become disillusioned. This war was no breakfast spell. Obviously, we've been fighting a year and a half. It wasn't over quick like the boys thought. And that's the end of the chapter. There's a few places on the map that we talked about at this time that I didn't locate on there for you. I may take some time to do that for you as before our next chapter, but I'll have it at the beginning of the next lesson. Please take the time to answer your questions for chapter 8. I'm not sure, I think 8 and 9 will be submitted together because 6 and 7 were together before the quiz. So have a good day.